As we continue to see an increase in home invasions, the conversation on whether the Stand Your Ground law should be adopted has started in certain sectors, with even the political leaders of the various parties chiming in to give their views. And so this morning we're going to be talking to attorney Martin George to unpack the legal ramifications, if any, of this practice. Mr. George, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us on Now.
Yes, hi, good morning to you, and good morning to all your viewers on TTT and the Now program, and good morning, Trinidad and Tobago.
Now, Mr. George, just to provide some context, what is the Stand Your Ground legislation or law?
All right, so basically what that legislation says is that if it is that you think or feel that you are under threat of violent attack by someone, then you are entitled to use deadly force to repel it or to defend yourself or your loved ones. So in other words, it means that you can basically, if you are armed, then of course you can, I guess, shoot to kill, so to speak, because you think you are under threat of deadly force. Of course, the question as to whether you were really under threat of deadly force is then always going to be an issue of fact to be determined by, I guess, the prosecutors or the jury if ever a matter goes to trial. If we recall in 2012, remember the famous matter with Trayvon Martin, when he was shot by George Zimmerman, who said that he felt threatened. Of course, you had the racial dynamic in that matter. You know, I mean, of course, Trayvon Martin was a young Afro-American kid who had a chocolate bar in his pocket. He had just gone to purchase a chocolate bar. And, you know, George Zimmerman, who had a history of being almost like a vigilante neighborhood watch type person, who was, you know, there armed with his gun, basically, you know, on the lookout for whom he thought would be, I guess, maybe troublemakers or what you call it. You know, he then said that he felt threatened by this young man simply because the young man had a chocolate bar in his pocket, and he shot and killed Trayvon Martin. Right, so you remember all the protests that sparked as a result of that, because person said then, how could you say you felt you were under threat of deadly force with the boy having a chocolate bar, you know? And then, of course, you had the whole issue as to whether there was some element of him, you know, drawing that conclusion simply because it was a young Afro-American, you know, teenager who he faced in the scenario.
Yeah. Now, Mr. George, that is situation, as you mentioned, would have had some racial undertones. But let's go back a bit. Now, you said that it is, you know, if it is, you can use deadly force if you think that you are threatened or someone comes on your property. But what exactly is that deadly force?
Right. So it's like basically force that could kill someone. Basically, that's the thing, you know. So it's force that could kill someone. All right. I mean, think of this situation now in the with the New York subway killing, you know, where the Marine, you know, put this man in this chokehold for 15 minutes, you know, until he died, and then said, well, he felt threatened and the man was threatening other passengers. You saw the protest which was sparked, you know, across the US as a result, because persons said, well, look, even if you felt you had to subdue him, did you need to hold him in a chokehold for 15 minutes until he died? So it's not as simple as just saying, well, okay, I'm applying the law to say, well, I am defending myself against deadly force. The fact of the matter is you have to really prove that you were under some sort of immediate threat of deadly force, and basically you use the option of the Stand Your Ground law.
Yeah. And as it relates to the opposite of that, is there something else you can use in a situation like that? Because I think I've been reading something about, you know, duty to retreat or castle doctrine. Is that the opposite of, is there something a bit more subtle?
Right. So basically, the options in those scenarios really are fight or flight. You know, so in other words, if you do have an option to avoid the confrontation, then of course that is something you ought to seek to exercise, if you understand me. So if someone is outside your fenced, walled property, you know, supposedly making a threat, All right. If you have the option to simply go inside your house and the person remains outside your wall, and you can call the police, and let them come and deal with it, then certainly you do have a duty to exercise that option rather than simply running up to your wall, reaching over your wall and shooting the person and saying, well, I stood my ground. Because really and truly, you can't say that you had no other option. So that's where that comes in, because you have to consider the alternatives. So to say that Trinidad and Tobago should adopt this legislation as a solution to the crime problem, I'm not sure. I think it's an oversimplification, and it's a nice catchphrase, but really and truly, it does not deal with the root causes of crime and criminality in Trinidad and Tobago. You have to consider also, we've heard many business persons and lots of persons in the society in Trinidad and Tobago clamoring for getting legal firearms. Most of them say that they've not been able to get. So if you don't even have the means to protect yourself, then having the legislation is useless, because you are a sitting duck anyhow if you don't have any serious means to protect yourself. So I'm not sure it really
Mr. George,
necessarily is applicable.
Well, let's also look at our local context as well, because what law or legislation do we have? Is it only the Larceny Act, or is there something else that guides us in terms of common law as to what we can do with these when somebody invades our homes and how we can protect our property?
Well, of course, we all have the right to self-defense and defense of property and defense of loved ones. That's part of the common law in Trinidad and Tobago. It's part of our jurisprudence for years. We've had many situations where persons have been successfully using that to say, well, look, I was under this kind of threat and therefore I had to defend myself. So our law is really self-defense. Stand your ground goes a little bit further, where basically you're saying that, look, even though I am not just only defending myself, I am allowed to attack with deadly force. You see, so then,
Mr. George, is the difference really just the wording? Because with stand your ground, right?
No,
you can use deadly force. I mean, because let's give an example with the Arangwe situation. That family was held under duress for a long time. And you mentioned earlier that there are options you can use before employing something like stand your ground. So in a situation like that, this perpetrator has come onto your property. They're causing your family stress. They may have tied you up. You are basically you're a victim in this situation. Is there nothing you can do to defend yourself at that point, apart from calling the police officer and hoping that they come on time to, to deal with the issue?
All right, so let me clarify. In terms of self-defense, you always have to measure the level of force or the level of threat used in the attack, and you have to ensure that you don't give an overly excessive reaction. So in other words, if someone is coming at you maybe with a stick or say even a baton, all right, then if you pull out your gun and you just shoot the person, it may be questioned as to, well, did you have any other options? In other words, all right, okay, with the baton, maybe they might have been able to hit you, but is it something that you could consider a murderous weapon? I mean, I guess in certain circumstances, yes, it could. But in terms of your defense now, you may have to measure in terms of, did I use sufficient, equity in terms of my response, or did I overreact in terms of the force that I used to repel this attacker? So that's the difference. Where stand your ground is not interested in, measuring the extent of your response. You are entitled to use deadly force, plain and simple. Once you genuinely believe that you were under this threat of attack, which could result in deadly consequences to yourself.
Yeah, and let's also take another look at the stand your ground legislation, because I've seen reports where people say oftentimes it often leads to more homicides than would have happened if there was another type of legislation around. I mean, have you seen any sort of text or anything that could support this, that maybe that stand your ground legislation can lead to more homicides?
Well, I mean, you look at the scenario I mean, I think the US is the best example to use, and you see how many scenarios where you see persons being killed, being shot, I mean, it really does lead to that, because basically you end up basically trying to arm everybody, and you end up being basically a trigger happy nation. Look at the US. Remember Breonna Taylor, I mean, her boyfriend pulled his firearm because the police broke into their apartment wrongfully, and they started shooting. He tried shooting back, and instead Breonna Taylor was killed. So the point is, yes, it does lead to more killings, I think, and I'm not sure at all that it is the solution in Trinidad and Tobago, because it starts off with you having to arm more citizens. It means that you have to produce more and more FULs, give people more legal guns, and of course, it can result in more homicides.
Yeah.
And you saw recently where the Commissioner of Police, Ms. Erla Christopher, in her sworn affidavit in court, said that their statistics show that over 100 legal firearms were used in crimes. So therefore, you also have to consider that aspect. So arming more citizens to that extent to say, well, look, basically, you end up like Florida, where everybody has a gun, down to little children have guns. Remember, a 6-year-old last year took his parents' gun and went to school and shot his teacher and killed the teacher. So I mean, do we really want that type of scenario in Trinidad and Tobago?
Yeah.
By contrast, you look at somewhere like Japan, which has very strict gun laws, and they are very restrictive in terms of giving out legal firearms, and as a result, their homicides from firearms are among the lowest in the world. So we have to do that balancing act. And I don't think that, just bandying about these catchphrases and these nice sounding words to say, oh, stand your ground legislation. I think it's by far too simplistic an idea to solve Trinidad and Tobago's crime.
Mr. George, are there any other jurisdictions that practice the stand your ground or any sort of variation of this, or is this simply a U.S. sort of legislation?
Your question just
Mr. George?
Silent, sorry.
Can you hear me now? Let me know when you're hearing me.
Right, I'm hearing you now.
Hearing you now? Yeah. So I was just asking, is there any sort of stand your ground legislation anywhere else in the world?
Went again.
I went again.
Sorry.
Can you hear me?
I'm not sure what's happening, but you're going in and out in terms of your
Mr. George, let me know when you're hearing me. Can you hear me now?
I'm hearing you now.
You're hearing me now? You're still hearing me?
Yes, you said
okay.
What other jurisdictions?
Yeah, so are there other jurisdictions where this stand your ground legislation exists, or is this just the U.S.?
All right.
Mr. George, I think you lost me again.
From the first part of the question, I heard you said, are there other jurisdictions where the stand your ground law has been proven effective?
Well, not effective, but maybe exists. But yes, you can answer to the effective point, because I don't want to lose you again.
So the thing is, I mean, it's a legislation which I think generally has shown that it only really has limited success in terms of any crime reduction. It's really more for protection of persons and to give you the right, if you are already an owner of a legal firearm, the right to say, well, look, I can use deadly force in the circumstances. But it's not something that at all I would suggest has been proven in any jurisdiction to have any success as a crime reduction strategy.
Yeah, and we're almost out of time, Mr. George. My final question, I hope you're hearing me. Earlier, you would have mentioned that maybe the legislation isn't needed, but what's needed is maybe faster work as it relates to our justice system. Can you speak some more to that in terms of how we can bring criminals to justice as sort of a preventative measures for others who may want to go down that same road?
Right. Well, I mean, definitely the justice system in Trinidad and Tobago has been, stymied for years, decades, with its, very slow progress. I mean, I think the locus classicus is the set of Piarco cases, which we know took about 18 years at least in the system, only to have them, dismissed and thrown out. And, so really and truly, we have a poor track record in that regard. In fairness to the judiciary, there have been attempts to start to speed up things. You have the criminal proceedings rules, which have been enacted, and that has started to make some progress. You have the paper committals legislation, which has been enacted, whereby you are able to do a preliminary inquiry on paper as opposed to calling each witness to give their testimony from the start all over again. So there are things that are being done. However, there's still need for greater efficiency and efficacy in the dispensation of justice. The DPP has been repeatedly calling and saying that he does not have enough staff or resources. And well, of course, we saw recently he had a meeting with the Attorney General, hopefully to address these issues, but we are not where we should be. That's a fact, and that is a major issue in terms of the overall delivery of justice in Trinidad and Tobago.
Mr. George, let me thank you so much. Always a pleasure when you visit us here on the Now Morning Show. Hopefully one day we can see you in studio, although I know that you're in beautiful Tobago. So please enjoy the rest of your day. And thank you so much for joining us on the Now Morning Show.
You're welcome.
And that was attorney at law, Mr. Martin Georges, sharing his thoughts on the Stand Your Ground legislation and whether or not it's going to work in a T&T context. You're on the Now Morning Show. We're going to take a break and be right back. Stay with us.